So I'm going to step away a little bit from the paper because I feel sorry for those of you who are later because you keep changing your themes based on the conversations, right? Or that's at least what I did. So my whole thing comes really out of learning theory and pedagogical theory and my conversion. So I want to say that even though we don't see much moral guidance going on in the university in terms of what we're talking about, moral guidance is always going on. Even in I studied, and I had not put this in the paper, but I just finished a huge study of 42 highly effective teachers in the worst schools in Los Angeles. In other words, if a child got in their classroom, they could easily move up 3 grade levels. While in those classroom next door, they could easily drop a grade level. Okay, so that's the context. The teachers that we studied were constantly giving moral guidance. And they did so in the ways in which they organized the classroom, the rules they ran, the reasons they gave for the rules. So we had one teacher, for example, her major rule was leave no man behind. That is, if your neighbor is struggling, it's your responsibility to help him, and if you can't help him, to get my attention to help him, right? So that is the good news, I guess. The bad news is bad teachers doing the same thing the other way. That is, there are teachers teaching kids very radical, all these radical things that are out in the culture and in the secular universities in particular. So I want to, so really for me, conduct comes out, the science of ethics, the utilitarian, the behaviorists, the non-cognitive group, the postmodernists still fill education. And the critical theorists are really taking over. I was thinking as we talked a minute ago about defining the good person by identifying them. Well, I worked with Mother Teresa, part of my help in my conversion, for 2 months, and about a year and a half before she died. And I hear conversations that claim that Mother Teresa was not a good person. And it goes something like this. She loved the poor, but she didn't really want to get them out of it, so she didn't teach the poor to rebel. She taught the poor to accept their own conditions. Okay, so I just wanted to slip that in because it is a reality in the world, and it is a reality in the secular universities. So I always get confronted with that. The next thing I just wanted to mention is that I'm going to have to take up a little bit for science. And I'm going to take up for it in this way. It's the one thing that can actually show that some of these other things are absolutely wrong. So if you look at Mark Regnerus's work on the family, it's pretty clear, just from the thousands and thousands of cases that he runs in his statistics, that it's pretty good for kids to be parented by a male and a female who stay together, okay? So there are things that I don't think we can throw science out and call all science scientism. I think we have to be very, very careful about that. And even with the teachers, one of my basic projects with the several-year-long study of these teachers is to show that teachers who were really effective were not the radical teachers that we used as examples of great teachers. I didn't figure they were, and they clearly weren't. So there are reasons for that. I think that we have to also pay attention to the fact that 45% of Christian students, Christians, actually 45% of them who go to college end up in the sciences. And I think there's a reason for that. I think they do find that they're going to find something true, and I think they know they won't be contested extremely by these other kinds of things. Science, at least, does not believe that the hydrogen atom cares what you think about it, right? I mean, there is an advantage to that it doesn't care how you feel about it or how you think about it. So Dallas is talking about the moral knowledge, and he even says knowledge is not enough, but its absence makes it impossible. And I just want to suggest that it may not be, moral knowledge may not be unknowable so much in the culture right now as unacceptable to people. That it's not really, and that's sort of what you were saying, I think, also, and you raised that same issue a few minutes ago, I think. So stepping away a little bit further from the paper, I want to suggest that one of our problems as academicians is that we're heavily dependent on cognitive analysis, when in fact, the fundamental roots of the loss of moral knowledge, I believe, is more spiritual than it is intellectual. It was desire that defined my moral reasoning at every point. It was nothing else. It wasn't an intellectual exercise I was doing to define what I believed moral was. So our souls, our mind, our will, emotions may be simple exaggerations of our own beliefs at any given moment. And when we think about restoring moral knowledge, we have to really believe that it may fundamentally not be an intellectual task. So I'll give you just a glimpse. Before my conversion, I could not grasp Christianity intellectually. Okay, it looked silly to me. You know, Jesus never talked in terms of, he never used academic language. He never used abstract language. And I think that we may be underestimating the power and the necessity of conversion in terms of really getting at what the definition of moral knowledge is. I mean, I know that we're trying to sort of do this as a whole, and I can appreciate that, but at the same time, I'm not sure that we can be that confident that just anybody's going to have access to thinking through moral knowledge. And I mentioned in the paper the quote by C.S. Lewis that the tower, everything can be seen from the top, but not everything can be seen from the bottom. And one of the people who most explained what was going on with me was Leslie Newbigin in, trying to think which one of his books, but Leslie Newbigin defines the radical conversion this way. He says, the Christian claim is that though the Christian worldview can in no way be reached by any logical step from the axioms of other worldviews, nevertheless, the Christian worldview does offer a wider rationality that embraces and does not contradict the rationality of these other worldviews, the true rationality of those. He says again that theology is a kind of anthropology. Intellectual integrity after the Enlightenment required that the Bible must be understood in terms of what is possible for the modern person to believe, and that is what we're doing. I mean, that is kind of what we're after here. He suggested that we needed to develop a new plausibility structure in which the most real of all realities is the living God whose character is rendered for us in the pages of Scripture. So here's how he describes the difference of the two plausibility structures. He says the difference between the two plausibility structures is seen most sharply at a point where we have to come to terms with the Christian tradition about the resurrection of Jesus. The community of faith makes the confession that God raised Jesus from the dead and the tomb was empty thereafter. Within the plausibility structure of the modern world, this will become something like the following. The disciples had a series of experiences that led them to the belief that in some sense Jesus was still alive and therefore to interpret the cross as victory and not defeat. This experience can be accepted as a fact. People do have such psychological experiences. If this is what is meant by the Easter event, it qualifies for admission into the world of fact. The former statement, i.e. that the tomb was empty, can be accepted as a fact only if the whole plausibility structure of contemporary Western culture is called into question. I honestly think it's that serious. I think that's what we're precisely what we're up against in terms of trying to define what is a good person. It's a clash or an incongruity of plausibility structures. And particularly if you look at what's going on in the secular university right now, the clash is pretty enormous. The gulf is pretty deep. So my gut sense of the loss of moral knowledge is that we have been formed too much by the post-Christian academy and given up too much to secularism. And we see this disconnect, I think. I mean, I still see it. The difference between going to church on Sunday and then showing up at the university on Monday. There is a kind of gulf there that can only be bridged by just forgetting Sunday when you get there on Monday. I mean, in that sort of way. But only after my conversion did reading scriptures finally become possible, seem reasonable, meaningful, and the meanings and gave me meanings well outside my pre-conversion mind. They were now possible. My soul and emotions were now capable of being informed by my spirit, and I don't really mean emotions at all in spirit. I've struggled to find some author that actually helped me understand the difference, because I was well aware there was a big difference between my emotions and my spirit. And the best person I could find was Watchman Nee. And it was his book he wrote in prison called The Spiritual Man, which is really basically 3 of the same books put together into one book. But he does, I think, the best explanation of the difference between knowing in one way and knowing in another way. You know, what does your mind do? What does your soul do? What does your spirit do? And he very clearly separates the soul and the spirit.